Kliment Voroshilov is a legend and mystery of Soviet history. A simple mechanic who became a marshal, a hero of the Civil War who created the first Cavalry Army, People's Commissar of Defense who led the army for 15 years. But why was he removed from command at the most critical moment of the Great Patriotic War? What lies behind the ceremonial portraits and official biographies? The story of a man who was unable to step out of the 19th century into the 20th, from cavalry attacks into the era of tanks and aircraft. Today we will tell the truth about the marshal whose glory turned into tragedy. If you are interested in the real story, without embellishment, subscribe to our channel and like this video. And in the comments, write your opinion. Was Voroshilov a victim of circumstances, or was he himself to blame for the tragedies that occurred under his command? Can his participation in the repressions be justified by his revolutionary merits? Let's discuss this complex issue together. Kliment Efremovich Voroshilov was born on January 23, 1881, in the village of Verkhny, Bakhmutsky Uyezd, Yekaterinoslav Governorate, in what is now the Lugansk Oblast. His family belonged to the poorest strata of the population. His father, Efrem Andreevich, worked as a track inspector on the railroad, and his mother, Maria Vasilyevna, was a housewife and raised the children. There were 7 children in the family, and Kliment was one of the youngest. The future marshal's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of hardship and constant struggle for survival. From an early age, the boy understood what hard physical labor was and what it meant to earn his bread with his own hands. Kliment's education was minimal. Only 2 grades of Zemstvo school. At the age of 9, he was already working as a shepherd to help his family. Then, as a teenager, he got a job in a mine, where he learned all the hardships of a miner's work. Going down into the mine in those days meant risking your life every day. Safety precautions were practically non-existent, and accidents happened regularly. Voroshilov worked as a coal miner, hauling heavy carts along underground tunnels. It was exhausting work that crippled people and killed them prematurely. But it was here, in the mining environment, that the young Kliment first encountered the ideas of social justice and class struggle. In 1899, the 18-year-old Voroshilov moved to Lugansk, where he found work as a mechanic at the Hartmann locomotive factory. It was one of the largest industrial enterprises in the Russian Empire, employing thousands of workers. The factory was famous not only for its products, but also for the revolutionary sentiments among its workers. Underground circles operated here, illegal literature was distributed, and social democratic ideas were propagated. The young mechanic quickly proved himself to be a capable worker and an active participant in the labor movement. He eagerly read banned pamphlets, attended secret meetings, and learned to understand the mechanisms of exploitation and class oppression. The Hartmann factory became a real school of life for Voroshilov. Here, he mastered the locksmith's craft, learned to work with metal, and understand the structure of locomotives and mechanisms. But most importantly, here, he received a political education that no gymnasium could provide. The working-class environment of Lugansk was seething with passion, discussing the events of the 1905 revolution and calling for the struggle for workers' rights. Voroshilov absorbed these ideas like a sponge, forming his worldview and preparing for future revolutionary activity. What prompted a simple locksmith to link his fate with the underground and begin a dangerous struggle against the Tsarist regime? In 1903, Voroshilov joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It was a serious and conscious step, signifying a transition to active revolutionary activity. Membership in the RSDLP in those years automatically made a person a criminal in the eyes of the Tsarist authorities. Underground work was punishable by exile to Siberia, hard labor, or long years of imprisonment. But this did not stop the young worker. He began to distribute illegal literature among his comrades at the factory, organize meetings, and conduct propaganda work. Kliment's party nickname was simple, Volodya, and he was known by this name in the underground circles of Lugansk. The revolution of 1905 found Voroshilov in the thick of events. He actively participated in organizing strikes at the Hartmann factory, spoke at workers' meetings, and helped create combat squads. Lugansk was in turmoil. Workers demanded an 8-hour workday, higher wages, and better working conditions. The police and troops brutally suppressed the protests, but the revolutionary movement was gaining strength. Voroshilov proved himself to be a decisive and fearless agitator, capable of inspiring the masses. It was during these years that he gained his first experience in organizational work and leadership. After the defeat of the First Russian Revolution, mass repression began. The Tsarist government cracked down on revolutionaries throughout the country. Many were arrested, sent into exile, or hanged by military field courts. Voroshilov managed to evade persecution for some time, but in 1907, he was finally arrested. The charges were serious: membership in an illegal organization and subversive activities against the state. He faced a long exile to remote areas of Siberia. However, Kliment had no intention of sitting meekly in prison and waiting for his sentence. In 1908, Voroshilov escaped from custody. The details of this escape remain unclear. According to some sources, he was helped by his party comrades. According to others, he took advantage of the negligence of the escort. Either way, Kliment found himself free and was forced to hide from the police. A period of underground life began, during which he had to constantly change his place of residence, use false documents, and avoid meeting old acquaintances. Voroshilov moved from city to city: St. Petersburg, Baku, and then back to Donbass. Everywhere he continued his party work, maintained ties with the revolutionary underground, and prepared for a new revolutionary upsurge. In Baku, Voroshilov met local Bolsheviks and participated in organizing oil workers. The Baku oil fields were one of the centers of the labor movement in the Russian Empire. Tens of thousands of workers labored here in the most difficult conditions, and strong trade unions and party organizations were active here. Kliment studied the experience of his Baku comrades, learned methods of clandestine work, and established connections between various revolutionary groups. These years of wandering and underground struggle tempered his character, teaching him caution and the ability to act in difficult conditions. But ahead lay events that would turn his whole life upside down and give him the opportunity to prove himself not as an underground activist, but as a military commander. What awaited Russia, and what role was the former Luhansk locksmith destined to play in the coming events? World War I began in August 1914, and the Russian Empire found itself drawn into a bloody conflict. Voroshilov continued his underground work at this time, but military events made adjustments to his revolutionary activities. The Bolsheviks took a defeatist stance, calling for the imperialist war to be turned into a civil war. Kliment shared these views and continued to agitate against the war among the workers. However, the real moment for the revolutionaries did not come until 1917, when the Russian Empire collapsed under the weight of military defeats and internal contradictions. The February Revolution of 1917 found Voroshilov in Petrograd. The capital was in turmoil. Demonstrations were taking place in the streets, troops were siding with the rebels, and the Tsarist government was losing control of the situation. Kliment actively participated in the revolutionary events, helping to organize workers' detachments and establishing connections between different areas of the city. After the abdication of Nicholas II, power passed to the provisional government. But the Bolsheviks had no intention of stopping there. Voroshilov returned to his native Lugansk, where he was well known and had strong ties among the workers. In Lugansk, Kliment became one of the leaders of the local Bolshevik organization. He organized Red Guard detachments, agitated among workers and soldiers, and prepared to seize power in the city. The October Revolution in Petrograd inspired local Bolsheviks to act decisively. In Lugansk, an armed confrontation began between the Red Guards and supporters of the provisional government. Voroshilov personally led the combat operations, demonstrating courage and organizational skills. By the end of 1917, Soviet power had been established in the Donbass, and the Bolsheviks were faced with the task of holding their positions. But the real war was just beginning. In the spring of 1918, German troops began an offensive in Ukraine. Under the terms of the Brest Peace Treaty, Soviet Russia was forced to cede vast territories, including the Donbass. The German army advanced rapidly into the country, sweeping away scattered Red Guard units. Voroshilov organized partisan resistance, but the forces were unequal. He had to retreat, escape persecution, and make his way to Soviet Russia. This bitter experience of retreat and guerrilla warfare would later serve him well. By the summer of 1918, Voroshilov found himself in Tsaritsyn, a city on the Volga River that was of great strategic importance. Supply routes for bread from the fertile regions of southern Russia to the starving industrial centers passed through Tsaritsyn. Control of the city meant control of food resources. It was here, in Tsaritsyn, that Voroshilov's military glory and his close cooperation with Joseph Stalin began. The city was under threat of capture by the White Cossack troops of Ataman Krasnov. The Red forces were few in number and poorly organized. A decisive and energetic commander was needed, one capable of restoring order and organizing the defense. That commander was Kliment Voroshilov, appointed commander of the defense of Tsaritsyn. Would a former locksmith with no military training be able to stand up to experienced Cossack generals and hold on to a strategically important city? The defense of Tsaritsyn in the summer and fall of 1918 was Voroshilov's first serious military test. He was appointed commander of the 10th Army, which defended the city. Joseph Stalin also arrived in Tsaritsyn as the representative of the Council of People's Commissars for Food Affairs. The two revolutionaries developed a close relationship based on shared views and mutual trust. Together, they organized the city's defense, disregarding the orders of military experts from Moscow. Voroshilov and Stalin believed that the old Tsarist officers were unreliable and capable of betraying the revolution. This confrontation with military experts would become a constant theme in Voroshilov's activities throughout the Civil War. White Cossack troops under the command of General Krasnov advanced on Tsaritsyn from the south. The Cossacks were experienced fighters who knew the terrain well and were skilled in maneuver warfare. They had cavalry, artillery, and the fighting spirit of victors. The Red Army was inferior to them in numbers and weaponry, but they possessed revolutionary enthusiasm and faith in the righteousness of their cause. Voroshilov personally rode around the front lines, inspiring the fighters and organizing counterattacks. He was not an armchair commander. Kliment was always where the action was hottest, risking his life alongside the ordinary Red Army soldiers. This style of command earned him respect and popularity among the soldiers. The battles for Tsaritsyn were fierce. The Whites broke through to the outskirts of the city several times, and street fighting ensued. The Red Army soldiers fought for every house and every street. The losses on both sides were enormous. Voroshilov showed tenacity and determination, giving orders to hold out to the last. At critical moments, he threw his last reserves into battle, organized sudden counterattacks, and did not allow the enemy to consolidate their captured positions. Gradually, the White Army's offensive momentum dried up. They suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat from the city. Tsaritsyn remained in the hands of the Reds, and this was a crucial victory for the young Red Army. For the defense of Tsaritsyn, Voroshilov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, one of the first in Soviet Russia. His name became known throughout the country as the name of a hero of the Civil War. But Kliment did not rest on his laurels. The war continued, and new battles lay ahead. In 1919, Voroshilov fought in Ukraine against Denikin's troops. The White Army was advancing from the south, threatening Moscow and industrial centers. The Red Command needed decisive and energetic commanders capable of stopping the enemy's advance. It was during this period that the idea of creating a cavalry army was born. a mobile formation capable of waging a maneuverable war across the vast expanses of southern Russia. The initiator of the creation of the First Cavalry Army was Semyon Budyonny, but Voroshilov became one of its creators and commanders. The Cavalry Army united the best cavalry units of the Red Army, the Don, Kuban, and Terek Cossack regiments that had gone over to the Bolsheviks. It was a formidable force, capable of conducting deep raids into enemy rear areas, destroying communications, and spreading panic. Voroshilov commanded one of the divisions of the Cavalry Army and participated in all major operations of this illustrious formation. How did the cavalry, considered an outdated branch of the military, suddenly become the main striking force of the Red Army and decide the outcome of the Civil War? The First Cavalry Army, commanded by Budyonny, Voroshilov, and other commanders, became a legend of the Civil War. In the fall of 1919, the cavalry destroyed Denikin's troops in southern Russia. They carried out deep cavalry raids, surrounded and destroyed entire enemy units, and captured huge trophies. The Whites could not withstand the massive cavalry attacks of the Reds. Budyonny and Voroshilov's cavalrymen broke into the enemy's rear, sowing panic and chaos and disrupting the command of the troops. Denikin's offensive on Moscow faltered, and the White Army began to retreat south, losing territory and personnel. Voroshilov commanded the 2nd Cavalry Division of the Konarmia, which participated in all major operations. His division was distinguished by its discipline and fighting spirit. Kliment was a strict commander who demanded iron discipline and unquestioning obedience to orders. At the same time, he cared for his soldiers, shared the hardships of military life with them, and did not hide behind his subordinates in battle. This style of command inspired respect and loyalty. The cavalrymen loved their commanders and were ready to follow them through fire and water. Songs about the cavalry army were sung throughout the country, and the names of Budyonny and Voroshilov were on everyone's lips. In 1920, the First Cavalry Army fought in the Polish campaign. Soviet Russia attempted to export the revolution to Europe via Poland. The Konarmia advanced on Lviv and participated in the battles near Warsaw. However, the Polish campaign ended in failure. The Red Army was defeated near Warsaw and was forced to retreat. It was a bitter lesson, showing that revolutionary enthusiasm cannot always compensate for a lack of organization and material support. Voroshilov learned important lessons about modern warfare from the Polish campaign, although many of them were never fully understood. After the Polish campaign, the Konarmia was transferred south to fight Wrangel's troops in Crimea. This was the last major operation of the Civil War. Baron Wrangel's White Army had entrenched itself in Crimea and posed a serious threat. The Red Command concentrated significant forces in the Crimean direction, including the First Cavalry Army. In the fall of 1920, an offensive began on Perekop, a narrow isthmus connecting Crimea with the mainland. The Perekop fortifications were considered impregnable, and the Whites were confident that they could hold this line. The assault on Perekop was a bloody battle. The Red troops advanced on the fortifications under deadly enemy fire. The losses were enormous, but the Soviet command did not spare its men. Voroshilov and his division participated in the breakthrough of enemy positions. The cavalry dismounted and attacked on foot, overcoming barbed wire barriers and minefields. After several days of fierce fighting, Perekop was taken, and the Red Army poured into Crimea. Wrangel's troops began their evacuation through the Black Sea ports. By the end of November 1920, Crimea was completely occupied by the Reds, and the civil war on European territory in Russia was effectively over. Victory in the Civil War brought Voroshilov fame and high honors. He became one of the most famous military leaders of the young Soviet Republic. But what awaited the heroes of the Civil War in peacetime? The country lay in ruins, industry was destroyed, and agriculture was in decline. A new army had to be built to meet the demands of the times. And here the main contradictions in Voroshilov's approaches to military construction became apparent. Between the experience of the Civil War and the challenges of the modern world. With the end of the Civil War, Soviet Russia faced the task of creating a regular peacetime army. The Red Army needed reforming. It was necessary to move from guerrilla warfare methods to modern military doctrines, master new technology, and train qualified personnel. In 1921, Voroshilov was appointed commander of the North Caucasus Military District. It was an important and responsible position, requiring not only military but also administrative talents. In the North Caucasus, pockets of resistance to Soviet power still smoldered. Bandit groups were active, and the situation remained tense. Kliment Voroshilov proved himself to be a tough and decisive leader. He suppressed any manifestations of anti-Soviet sentiment, organized the fight against banditry, and strengthened local party and Soviet structures. At the same time, he was engaged in building a regular army in the district, forming new units, training commanders, and organizing supplies in the daily life of the troops. There was a huge amount of work to be done, and Voroshilov coped with it, relying on his experience and energy. However, his leadership methods remained largely unchanged. He did not trust military specialists from the old army, preferring to promote battle-tested party members to command positions, even if they did not have sufficient military education. In 1925, Voroshilov was appointed People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs and chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council of the USSR. This was the highest military position in the country, meaning full responsibility for the state of the armed forces. Voroshilov's appointment to this post was the result of political struggle within the party leadership. Stalin, strengthening his position, promoted people loyal to him to key posts. Kliment Voroshilov was one of those people. He unconditionally supported Stalin in all internal party conflicts and was ready to implement any of his decisions. As People's Commissar of Defense, Voroshilov launched a large-scale military construction program. In the 1920s, the Red Army was relatively small, based on a territorial militia system in which the majority of servicemen underwent short-term training and then returned to civilian work. There were few permanent military units. Voroshilov understood that such an army was incapable of waging modern warfare against a serious enemy. It was necessary to increase the number of permanent units and equip the army with new technology: tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The industrialization of the country began, and part of its resources were directed toward military needs. In the 1930s, the Red Army grew rapidly and modernized. Tank and mechanized corps were created, military aviation developed, and a navy was built. Soviet designers developed new types of weapons: the T-26 and T-35 tanks, the I-15 and I-16 fighters, and the TB-3 bombers. New military schools and academies were opened to train command personnel. By the end of the 1930s, the Red Army had become one of the strongest in the world in terms of numbers and equipment. But quantitative indicators do not always reflect real combat power. There were serious problems with the organization of troops, the training of commanders, and the interaction of different branches of the military. And these problems would soon manifest themselves in the most tragic way. The issue of military personnel was particularly painful for the army. Voroshilov continued to distrust military specialists, former Tsarist officers who served in the Red Army. He believed that the army needed commanders from the working class and peasantry who were loyal to the Soviet government. But loyalty is no substitute for professionalism. Many of the promoted officers did not have sufficient military education and experience in commanding large units in modern warfare. This approach to personnel policy would have tragic consequences, especially in the context of the looming Great War. But for now, it was still a long way off, and Voroshilov confidently occupied one of the highest positions in the Soviet hierarchy. How long will this confidence last? And what will cause him to doubt the correctness of the chosen path? In 1937, mass repressions began in the Soviet Union, known as the Great Terror. Millions of people from all walks of life became victims of political persecution. Party workers, economists, intellectuals, ordinary citizens. The Red Army was not spared from the repressions either. The blow fell first and foremost on the senior command. In June 1937, Marshal Tukhachevsky was arrested along with a group of other high-ranking military leaders. They were accused of participating in a military conspiracy, spying for Germany, and preparing a coup d'etat. After a short closed trial, they were all shot. As People's Commissar of Defense, Voroshilov was directly involved in organizing the repression of the army's command structure. He signed arrest warrants, authorized dismissals and expulsions from the party, and made denunciatory speeches against enemies of the people. Kliment Voroshilov sincerely believed, or pretended to believe, in the existence of a conspiracy in the army. For him, repression was a way to purge the army of unreliable elements and strengthen its ideological monolith. In addition, repression made it possible to settle scores with those military leaders who criticized Voroshilov's leadership methods and pointed out shortcomings in the training of troops. The scale of the repression in the army was catastrophic. Of the 5 marshals, 3 were repressed. Of the 15 commanders of the first and second ranks, 13 were repressed. Of the 85 corps commanders, 57 were repressed. Of the 196 division commanders, 110 were repressed. Virtually the entire senior and a significant part of the middle command were destroyed or sent to camps. They were replaced by young, inexperienced commanders who did not have sufficient training to manage large military units. The army was decapitated on the eve of the most terrible war in human history. Voroshilov did not see this as a tragedy. For him, political reliability was more important than military professionalism. He believed that commanders loyal to the party would be able to learn military skills in the course of their service, and that revolutionary spirit was more important than academic knowledge. This position reflected his own life experience. After all, he himself, without any military education, had become a marshal and People's Commissar of Defense. But the days of the Civil War were long gone. Modern warfare required knowledge of complex technology, the ability to coordinate the actions of various branches of the military, and an understanding of strategy and operational art. Revolutionary enthusiasm without professional knowledge was powerless against a well-trained enemy. Repression dealt a severe blow to the combat effectiveness of the Red Army. An atmosphere of fear and suspicion reigned in the troops. Commanders were afraid to show initiative, fearing accusations of sabotage. Military science virtually stopped developing. Any new ideas could be interpreted as sabotage. Promising developments in the use of mechanized units and deep operation tactics were curtailed. Many talented military theorists were destroyed. The army was thrown back in its development just when the military threat was becoming more and more real. In 1939, events began that revealed the true state of the Red Army after the repressions. In November, the Soviet-Finnish War, known as the Winter War, began. The Soviet Union demanded territorial concessions from Finland to ensure the security of Leningrad. The Finns refused, and the Red Army began military operations. The plan was to quickly break the resistance of Little Finland and dictate its terms. Voroshilov was confident of a quick victory. Soviet troops had a multiple numerical superiority in manpower and equipment. However, the war took a completely different turn. Although outnumbered, the Finnish army was well prepared for war in the harsh winter conditions and wooded terrain. Finnish soldiers on skis carried out daring raids on the rear of the Soviet troops, set up ambushes, surrounded and destroyed entire units. The Red Army soldiers, accustomed to warfare on the plains, did not know how to fight in the forest and in conditions of 40-degree frost. The commanders acted in a formulaic manner, showed no initiative, and sent troops into frontal attacks on the enemy's fortified positions. The losses were enormous, and the advance was minimal. The war, which was supposed to end in 2 weeks, dragged on for several months, and turned into a shameful bloodbath. Voroshilov, as People's Commissar of Defense, was directly responsible for the failure of the Finnish campaign. The army, which he had been building for 15 years, proved its unpreparedness for modern warfare. Outdated tactics, poor training of commanders, and a lack of coordination between the branches of the military all led to unnecessary losses and a protracted conflict. Only by throwing enormous forces to the front and grinding down the Finnish defense with numerical superiority was the Soviet Union able to achieve victory in March 1940. But this victory came at too high a price. The Red Army's losses amounted to more than 126,000 killed. The whole world saw the weakness of the Soviet armed forces, and this did not go unnoticed in Berlin. Will Soviet military leaders be able to draw the right conclusions from this bitter lesson? On June 22, 1941, the Great Patriotic War began. Germany and its allies launched a monstrous attack on the Soviet Union. More than 3 million Wehrmacht soldiers crossed the border, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. The German war machine, honed in European campaigns, operated with flawless precision. Army groups north, center, and south advanced across the entire front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The first days of the war were a disaster for the Red Army. German aircraft destroyed a significant portion of Soviet aircraft at airfields. Mechanized corps were crushed in border battles. Communication between headquarters was disrupted, and control of the troops was lost. Entire armies were surrounded. Voroshilov was in Moscow during the first days of the war, participating in meetings of the Supreme Command headquarters. The scale of the disaster did not become clear immediately. The reports coming in were contradictory and incomplete. When the real picture became clear, it was obvious that the army was on the verge of complete defeat. The Germans were rapidly advancing deep into the country, surrounding and destroying Soviet troops. In the first 3 weeks of the war, the Red Army lost more than 1 million men killed, wounded, and captured. These were the very troops that Voroshilov had been preparing for war for 15 years. The blame for the disastrous start of the war lay with the entire Soviet military and political leadership, including Voroshilov. Repressions decapitated the army, leaving it without experienced commanders. The outdated military doctrine did not correspond to the realities of modern warfare. The troops were not brought to combat readiness on the eve of the attack, despite numerous warnings from intelligence. The new equipment with which the army had been saturated in recent years had not been properly mastered by the personnel. Tanks broke down due to inept handling, and planes crashed due to insufficiently trained pilots. All this was the result of decisions made in the 1930s, when Voroshilov was in charge of military construction. On July 10, Voroshilov was appointed commander of the Northwestern Front, which included troops defending the approaches to Leningrad. This was one of the most important strategic directions. Army Group North was advancing on the second most important city in the Soviet Union, the largest industrial center and cradle of the revolution. The loss of Leningrad would have had not only military, but also enormous political significance. Voroshilov was tasked with stopping the German offensive and preventing the capture of the city. The Marshal went to Leningrad, determined to repeat the feat of defending Tsaritsyn 20 years earlier. However, the War of 1941 was radically different from the Civil War. The enemy was not the White Guard units with their limited resources, but the well-armed and well-trained German army. German troops employed blitzkrieg tactics, lightning warfare using massive tank strikes and air support. They surrounded large groups of Soviet troops, cut the front into pieces, and prevented them from establishing defensive lines. The command methods of the Civil War era, when the commander personally visited the positions and inspired the soldiers to fight, were insufficient. It was necessary to be able to coordinate the actions of large units over a large area, organize anti-tank defenses, and interact with the Air Force. Voroshilov did everything in his power. He did indeed personally visit the front lines, organize the defense of key areas, and tried to inspire the troops with his presence. But personal bravery could not compensate for the lack of modern military knowledge and experience in commanding troops in a large-scale war. The Germans continued to advance, pushing Soviet troops back towards Leningrad. By the end of August, Army Group North had broken through to the outskirts of the city. On September 8th, the Germans captured Schlisselburg on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, cutting Leningrad off from the rest of the country by land. The blockade began, which would last almost 900 days and claim the lives of hundreds of thousands of Leningraders. Was the 70-year-old Marshal able to cope with this monstrous responsibility? Or was the burden of past mistakes too heavy? September 1941 was a critical month for Leningrad. The city was surrounded on land, German artillery shelled residential areas, and aircraft carried out bombing raids. Food supplies were dwindling before our eyes. Supplies to the city had been cut off, and the population exceeded 2.5 million people. The troops of the Leningrad front, commanded by Voroshilov, were exhausted by constant fighting and retreat. The Germans were preparing to storm the city, pulling additional forces to its borders. Hitler wanted to take Leningrad and raze it to the ground, destroying the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. Voroshilov tried to organize the city's defense, drawing on his experience in the Civil War. He visited the troops, talked to the commanders, and demanded that they hold out to the last. All resources were mobilized. Workers from Leningrad factories formed a people's militia, while women and teenagers dug anti-tank trenches and built barricades. The city was turning into a fortress, ready for a long siege. But the heroism of the defenders alone was not enough. What was needed was competent organization of the defense, skillful use of available forces and resources, and proper planning of counterattacks. These were precisely the qualities that Voroshilov lacked. The front's troops suffered heavy losses in battles on the approaches to the city. Attempts to break through the blockade ended in failure. The Germans had superiority in the air and could concentrate their forces on selected directions. The Soviet command rushed about, trying to plug the gaps in the defense. But the initiative remained with the enemy. The Supreme Command headquarters in Moscow watched the developments near Leningrad with concern. Stalin received reports about the critical situation and gradually lost confidence in Voroshilov as a military commander. On September 8th, an incident occurred that finally undermined Voroshilov's reputation. During one of the meetings at the front headquarters, a dispute broke out between the Marshal and Zhukov, a representative of the High Command, over methods of defense. Zhukov insisted on concentrating forces and organizing counterattacks, while Voroshilov defended his decisions. The dispute turned into a heated exchange, during which, according to some accounts, Voroshilov threw his pistol on the table in anger, exclaiming that he could no longer command under such conditions. This emotional outburst showed that the Marshal was on the verge of a nervous breakdown and was unable to cope with the responsibility placed on him. On September 11th, Stalin removed Voroshilov from command of the Leningrad front. He was replaced by Georgy Zhukov, a tough and decisive military leader who had already proven himself in defensive battles. This was a heavy blow for Voroshilov. For the first time in his life, he had suffered such a clear failure, being publicly removed from command at the most critical moment. The 70-year-old Marshal understood that his military career was over. The experience of the Civil War, of which he was so proud, proved useless in the conditions of modern warfare. A new generation of military leaders, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, surpassed him in military art and the ability to command large formations. Zhukov immediately made changes to the organization of Leningrad's defenses. He reinforced the most vulnerable areas, organized artillery defenses, and created reserves for counterattacks. Under his leadership, Soviet troops repelled all German attempts to break through to the city. By the end of September, it became clear that it would not be possible to take Leningrad by storm, and the Germans switched to a systematic siege, hoping to wear the city down. A terrible winter of blockade began. during which hundreds of thousands of Leningraders died of hunger and cold. But the city held out, did not surrender to the enemy, and continued to resist. After being removed from command of the front, Voroshilov was transferred to another job. He had to find his place in the military machine, which was gradually learning to fight and win victories. But he would no longer be trusted to command troops at the front. His inability to adapt to the demands of modern warfare had cost the country too dearly. What role would the celebrated hero of the Civil War now play in a situation where young generals were leading the army to victory? After his removal from command of the Leningrad front, Voroshilov found himself in a difficult position. His authority as a military leader had been undermined, and Stalin's trust in him had been shaken. However, it was impossible to completely remove the famous Marshal from office. That would have meant admitting his own mistakes in the selection of military personnel and calling into question the entire system of military construction of the 1930s. Therefore, Voroshilov was not repressed or dismissed, but appointed to other, less responsible positions. In September 1941, he was sent to command the troops of the northwestern direction, but without direct control over combat operations. In fact, it was a form of honorable retirement from the front lines. Voroshilov continued to wear his marshal's stars, participated in meetings, and inspected units, but he no longer had any real influence on the course of military operations. Young generals who had gone through the harsh school of the first months of the war became the main actors on the front lines. Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Konev, Vasilevsky, Vatutin. These names now determined the course of military operations. They learned from their mistakes, mastered modern military art, and demonstrated qualities that the veterans of the Civil War lacked. In December 1941, after the Red Army pushed the Germans back from Moscow, Voroshilov was recalled to the capital. He was appointed representative of the High Command in various secondary areas. This meant coordinating the actions of several fronts, but not directly commanding troops. The Marshal carried out the orders of the High Command, inspected the troops, and relayed orders to the front commanders. The work was important, but it was not what the old commander, who wanted to repeat the feats of his youth, had dreamed of. In 1942, Voroshilov was the High Command's representative on the Volkhov front, where Soviet troops were trying to break through the blockade of Leningrad. The operation ended in failure. The Second Shock Army was surrounded and almost completely destroyed. It was one of the Red Army's greatest disasters in 1942. As a representative of the High Command, Voroshilov bore his share of responsibility for this tragedy, although the direct command was exercised by General Vlasov, who later defected to the Germans. It gradually became clear that Voroshilov had no place on the front lines as a combat commander. The war required a new type of professional, capable of commanding large armies, coordinating the actions of various branches of the military, and planning complex operations. The heroism and revolutionary enthusiasm that had helped win the Civil War were not enough against the Wehrmacht. Knowledge, experience of modern warfare, and the ability to learn and adapt quickly were needed. These qualities were demonstrated by the young generals who rose to prominence during the war. From the summer of 1942, Voroshilov was effectively removed from participation in the leadership of frontline operations. He was assigned secondary tasks, forming reserves, inspecting rear units, and organizing the partisan movement. The Marshal performed these duties conscientiously, but understood that his military career was over. His younger comrades from the Civil War, Budyonny, Timoshenko, were also pushed into the background. Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, and other generals of the new generation came to the fore. Voroshilov took his dismissal hard, but did not show it. He continued to carry out his assignments diligently, participated in meetings of the High Command, and maintained ties with the party leadership. Kliment Voroshilov understood that his role had changed, but he could not completely withdraw from affairs. The war was raging. The country was fighting for survival, and he wanted to contribute to the victory, even if it was not in the position he had dreamed of. There were still years of war ahead, and Voroshilov had to find his place in the new circumstances, when he was no longer required to demonstrate his talents as a commander, but rather his organizational skills and political loyalty. What role would the disgraced Marshal play in achieving victory? And would he be able to regain at least some of his former authority? In 1943, Voroshilov finally moved to work in the rear. He was no longer entrusted with commanding fronts or representing the high command in the active army. Instead, the Marshal was put in charge of a number of rear operations that were important for the war effort, but not directly related to the conduct of combat operations. One of his main tasks was to organize a trophy commission, responsible for accounting for and distributing weapons and property captured from the enemy. As the Red Army advanced and liberated occupied territories, the number of trophies grew steadily. Voroshilov headed the Trophy Committee under the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR. This was a large-scale organizational task that required the creation of a system for recording, storing, and distributing huge quantities of military property. Captured German tanks, guns, vehicles, and ammunition had to be classified, repaired, and transferred to the troops or to factories for study. Some of the captured weapons were used by the Red Army, while others were sent for remelting. Documents captured in German headquarters were transferred to intelligence for analysis. Kliment Voroshilov approached this work with his characteristic energy and meticulousness. At the same time, Voroshilov was involved in the partisan movement. He oversaw the central headquarters of the partisan movement, coordinated the actions of partisan detachments in the occupied territories, and organized the supply of weapons and ammunition to the partisans. The partisan war in the lands captured by the Germans gained momentum and inflicted serious damage on the enemy. Partisans blew up trains, attacked garrisons, and gathered intelligence. Voroshilov, who had experience in partisan warfare since the struggle against the German occupation of Ukraine in 1918, understood the specifics of this struggle well. Another area of Voroshilov's work was his participation in the activities of the State Defense Committee. The GKO was an emergency body that concentrated all power in its hands during wartime. Voroshilov was a member of the GKO and oversaw certain issues of military production and resource mobilization. He inspected defense factories, monitored the implementation of weapons production plans, and resolved issues of army supplies. This work was important for victory, although it did not bring the glory that successful command on the front lines did. Gradually, Voroshilov came to terms with his new role. He understood that he was not destined to return to commanding troops and focused on the tasks assigned to him. Kliment Voroshilov continued to be respected in party circles as an old Bolshevik and Stalin's comrade in arms. His authority as a veteran of the Revolution and the Civil War remained high, even if his military merits in the Great Patriotic War were controversial. Stalin did not forget his old comrades and gave them the opportunity to be useful in the areas of work available to them. In 1944, when the Red Army launched a broad offensive and began liberating Europe from Nazism, Voroshilov continued to work in the rear. He followed the successes of the Soviet troops and rejoiced in their victories, but he could not help feeling bitter that he was not participating in the triumph. Young marshals, Zhukov, Konev, Rokossovsky, led grandiose operations, liberated countries, and captured capitals. Their names resounded throughout the world. Voroshilov, however, remained in the shadows, performing necessary but inconspicuous work. By the end of the war, it had become clear that the era of Civil War veterans as military leaders had come to an end. The Great Patriotic War showed that modern warfare required different qualities from commanders than the partisan actions of the 1920s. A new generation of Soviet military leaders learned the lessons of the first defeats and learned how to defeat the strongest army in Europe. Voroshilov witnessed this generational change and understood its inevitability, but the post-war years were still ahead, and he had to find his place in the victorious country. What role would the famous Marshal play in peacetime, when the roar of battle was over? On May 9, 1945, the Great Patriotic War ended. Germany surrendered, and the Red Army celebrated its victory in Berlin. For the Soviet people, it was a great triumph, but one that came at a terrible price. The war claimed the lives of more than 27 million citizens of the USSR. The country lay in ruins, and it was necessary to rebuild the destroyed economy and return millions of demobilized soldiers to peaceful life. The party and state leadership faced new tasks of post-war reconstruction. Voroshilov, as a member of the highest party leadership, had to find his place in this new reality. After the war, Voroshilov was relieved of his position as chairman of the Trophy Committee and appointed deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR. It was a high government position, but more honorary than real. Kliment Voroshilov oversaw certain issues and participated in government meetings, but did not play a leading role in making important decisions. Real power was concentrated in the hands of Stalin and a small circle of his closest associates, Molotov, Beria, and Malenkov. Voroshilov was part of this circle more by virtue of being an old Bolshevik than because of any real influence. In 1946, Voroshilov turned 65. For a man of his generation, this was a respectable age, especially considering all the hardships he had endured in his life. The revolutionary underground, the Civil War, years of intense work in the highest government posts, and the stress of the war years. Kliment Voroshilov remained cheerful and continued to work actively, but he could no longer compete with the younger and more energetic party officials who had come to the fore during the war and post-war years. At the same time, Voroshilov held various honorary positions that emphasized his status as a veteran of the party and the revolution. He was a member of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, the highest governing body of the party, a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, and a member of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. At ceremonial gatherings, parades, and receptions, he was invariably present on the podium alongside other leaders of the country. His portraits hung at demonstrations alongside those of other leaders, but everyone understood that he did not hold real power. In the post-war years, Voroshilov was heavily involved in public work. He headed various committees and commissions, gave speeches at ceremonial events, wrote articles for newspapers, and met with war veterans. Kliment Voroshilov became a living symbol of the revolutionary past, a link between the generation that made the revolution and the youth born under Soviet power. His biography, full of dramatic events, served as an example for the education of young communists. Voroshilov was particularly active in working with military personnel. He oversaw military educational institutions, met with cadets from military schools, and spoke to students at military academies. The Marshal shared his memories of the Civil War, talked about his revolutionary path, and called on young officers to be loyal to the party and the socialist motherland. These meetings were popular. Young military personnel listened with interest to the stories of the famous commander about heroic times. However, the atmosphere in the country was gradually changing. In the last years of Stalin's life, repression resumed. The so-called Leningrad affair began, and many party and state officials were arrested. Voroshilov, as a member of Stalin's inner circle, could not help but participate in these processes. He voted for repressive measures, signed documents, and approved arrests. It was a heavy burden of responsibility that he shared with other members of the party leadership. By the early 1950s, Voroshilov remained one of the oldest members of the Soviet leadership. He was over 70, his health was beginning to fail, but he continued to work and participate in state affairs. Ahead lay Stalin's death, and a new era in the life of the country, when the old Marshal would have to play another important role. This time in a completely peaceful environment. What awaited the veteran of the revolution in a changed country? On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. His death marked the end of an era in the history of the Soviet Union. For Voroshilov, the loss of Stalin was not only a political event, but also a personal tragedy. They had known each other for more than 40 years, having gone through the revolution, the Civil War, industrialization, and the Great Patriotic War. Together, Kliment Voroshilov was one of the few old Bolsheviks who survived all the purges and repressions and retained the leader's trust until the very end. Now he had to find his place in the new leadership of the country. After Stalin's death, a struggle for power began among his successors. The main contenders were Georgy Malenkov, who headed the government, Nikita Khrushchev, who became first secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, and Lavrenti Beria, who controlled the state security organs. Voroshilov supported Khrushchev in this struggle. Perhaps he intuitively sensed who would emerge victorious, or perhaps he truly shared Khrushchev's views on the need for change after the long years of Stalin's rule. Either way, the Marshal ended up on the winning side. In March 1953, Voroshilov was elected chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, formerly the head of the Soviet state. It was an honorary and ceremonial position that did not confer real power, but emphasized the high status of its holder. Kliment Voroshilov accepted the credentials of foreign ambassadors, attended state receptions, and signed decrees of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. He became a symbol of continuity of power, a living embodiment of the connection between the heroic revolutionary past and the new era. In 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev delivered a speech on the cult of Stalin's personality, in which he exposed the crimes of Stalin's regime. This speech shook the party and the entire country. Voroshilov found himself in a difficult position. On the one hand, he was a close associate of Stalin and shared responsibility for the repressions. But on the other hand, he supported Khrushchev and the policy of de-Stalinization. Kliment Voroshilov publicly acknowledged the mistakes of the past, although this was not easy for him. He understood that the time of the veterans was passing and a new era was dawning. Voroshilov devoted his last years as chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet mainly to ceremonial activities. He met foreign guests, presented state awards, and participated in celebrations. Kliment Voroshilov remained cheerful despite his advanced age. He was already over 80. The Marshal continued to take an interest in political events, although he no longer actively participated in decision-making. His role was symbolic, to embody the revolutionary traditions and heroic past of the country. In May 1960, Voroshilov resigned from his post as chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. Officially, this was formalized as an honorary resignation due to age and health. Kliment Voroshilov was already 79 years old, and he was indeed tired of his state duties. Leonid Brezhnev, a representative of the next generation of party leaders, became the new head of state. For Voroshilov, this marked the end of a long career in the highest government posts, which had begun in the 1920s. After his resignation, Voroshilov continued to live in Moscow, enjoying all the privileges accorded to a former high-ranking official. He was allocated a state dacha, a personal car with a driver and medical care. Kliment Voroshilov wrote his memoirs, met with veterans, and communicated with his relatives. He lived to a ripe old age, becoming one of the last living witnesses of the Revolution and the Civil War. His long life spanned almost the entire Soviet period of Russian history, from the Tsarist era to developed socialism. Voroshilov remained an honorary member of the party leadership, was invited to ceremonial events, and his name was mentioned among the founding fathers of the Soviet state. But the real life of the country had long since moved on without him. New generations of leaders were tackling new challenges, and the old Marshal had become a living legend, a symbol of a bygone era. What thoughts crossed his mind in the last years of his life, as he looked back on his long and controversial journey? Kliment Voroshilov was a complex and controversial figure, much like the era in which he lived. On the one hand, he was a man sincerely devoted to revolutionary ideals, who rose from a simple worker to a marshal and member of the party's top leadership. Voroshilov was not a careerist in the usual sense. He truly believed in socialist values and the need to fight for a just society. His personal bravery in battle was beyond doubt. He was always on the front lines, sharing the dangers with ordinary soldiers, not hiding behind others. On the other hand, Voroshilov was a typical representative of the party nomenclature, for whom loyalty to the leader and the party line was above all else. He participated in repressions without hesitation, signed death sentences for his comrades in the Civil War, and destroyed those who could pose a threat to his position. Kliment Voroshilov shared with other members of Stalin's leadership responsibility for the tragedies of the 1930s and the deaths of millions of innocent people. This dark side of his biography cannot be forgotten or justified. In military terms, Voroshilov demonstrated qualities typical of Civil War commanders: personal bravery, the ability to inspire soldiers, and a readiness for decisive action. But he was catastrophically lacking in professional military knowledge and an understanding of modern military art. His attempts to apply the experience of guerrilla and cavalry warfare of the 1920s to the conditions of mechanized warfare of the 1940s ended in tragic failure. Thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Red Army soldiers paid with their lives for the inability of Voroshilov and commanders like him to adapt to the demands of the modern world. As a person, Voroshilov was distinguished by his simplicity in communication and lack of arrogance. He maintained contact with ordinary people, loved to meet with workers and peasants, and listen to their stories. Kliment Voroshilov was not an intellectual. His education was limited to 2 grades of Zemstva school and party courses. But he had a practical mind and organizational skills. He knew how to select personnel, create effective teams, and achieve the tasks set before him. These qualities helped him build an impressive career. In his family life, Voroshilov was devoted to his wife, Ekaterina Davidovna, with whom he lived for many decades. They married when they were young, and Ekaterina Davidovna shared with her husband all the hardships of the revolutionary struggle and subsequent life at the top of power. They had children and grandchildren, whom Kliment Voroshilov cared for. Despite his high position, the Marshal retained simple habits. He loved Russian baths, hunting, and fishing. He did not seek luxury, although he could have afforded any amenities. Voroshilov had many state awards. He was twice Hero of the Soviet Union, recipient of 8 Orders of Lenin, and many other Soviet and foreign orders. Cities, streets, factories, military schools, and ships were named after him. During his lifetime, he became a legend, a symbol of the revolutionary era. The cult of personality surrounding Voroshilov, although inferior to that of Stalin, was part of the Soviet propaganda system. His image was reproduced on posters, in films, and in fiction. After Stalin's death, and especially after Khrushchev's report on the cult of personality, attitudes toward Voroshilov became more critical. Historians began to analyze his role in the repressions and in the failures of the early period of the war. However, there was no complete reassessment of his activities. Voroshilov remained an honored veteran of the party, a living symbol of the revolutionary past. The authorities were not interested in a radical revision of his biography, as this could have called into question the legitimacy of the entire Soviet system. In the last years of his life, Voroshilov reflected a lot on his life, wrote his memoirs, and tried to make sense of his journey. He saw how the country was changing, how revolutionary traditions were becoming a thing of the past, how the generation of builders of socialism was being replaced by new people, for whom the revolution was already distant history. Kliment Voroshilov understood that he was the last representative of a bygone era. What legacy did he leave to new generations, and how will his role in history be assessed? Kliment Voroshilov died on December 2, 1969, in Moscow at the age of 91. His death came as no surprise. The Marshal was very old, his health had long been failing, and he had spent his last years quietly, away from public life. The news of the death of one of the last old Bolsheviks was met with due respect. Soviet newspapers published obituaries that spoke of the revolutionary achievements of the deceased, his contribution to the building of the Red Army, and his participation in the Great Patriotic War. There were no critical assessments of his activities in the obituaries. It was not customary to speak ill of recently deceased party leaders. Voroshilov's funeral was organized with state honors. The coffin with the Marshal's body was placed in the column hall of the House of Unions, where thousands of Muscovites came to say goodbye to him. Among those who came were veterans of the Civil War and the Great Patriotic War, party workers, and ordinary citizens who remembered Voroshilov from pre-war times. Members of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, led by Leonid Brezhnev, attended the funeral ceremony. Speeches were made about the deceased's services to the motherland, his devotion to the cause of communism, and his glorious revolutionary path. Voroshilov was cremated, and the urn with his ashes was buried in the Kremlin wall on Red Square, in the necropolis where other prominent figures of the Soviet state were laid to rest. This was the highest posthumous honor, which was bestowed only on the most distinguished party and state leaders. A place in the Kremlin wall meant that Voroshilov would forever remain part of the official history of the USSR, a symbol of the revolutionary era. A brief inscription with the name, years of life, and titles of the deceased was carved on the memorial plaque. With Voroshilov's death, an entire era came to an end. He was the last of Stalin's closest associates from the Civil War period to remain alive. Budeny died in 1973, and other Civil War commanders either perished in the repressions of the 1930s or did not survive the turmoil of war. Kliment Voroshilov turned out to be a long-lived man who lived to a ripe old age and became a living bridge between the revolution of 1917 and the developed socialism of the 1960s. His long life spanned more than half a century of Soviet history, with all its triumphs and tragedies. Voroshilov's legacy turned out to be controversial and ambiguous. On the one hand, he was indeed a revolutionary who fought for his ideals, a brave commander in the Civil War, and one of the founders of the Red Army. Without people like Voroshilov, the Bolsheviks would not have been able to hold on to power in the chaos of the Civil War. His contribution to the construction of the Soviet state in the 1920s and 1930s was significant. He sincerely believed in the socialist idea and devoted his entire life to it. On the other hand, Voroshilov shared responsibility for the repressions of the 1930s, which destroyed the cream of the Red Army's command staff. He signed execution lists, authorized arrests, and participated in creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. As People's Commissar of Defense, he bears his share of the blame for the Army's unpreparedness for war and for the catastrophic defeats of 1941. His inability to command troops in modern warfare cost the lives of thousands of Soviet soldiers. These dark sides of his biography cannot be forgotten or justified by his revolutionary achievements. The historical assessment of Voroshilov's role has changed over time. During the Soviet period, he was portrayed exclusively in a heroic light, as one of the founders of the Red Army, a talented commander, and a loyal Leninist. Criticism of his activities was practically impossible. After the collapse of the USSR, it became possible to conduct a more objective analysis. Historians gained access to archival documents that allowed them to reconstruct the real picture of events. It turned out that many of the victories in the Civil War attributed to Voroshilov were the result of collective efforts, and his role in them was exaggerated by propaganda. Voroshilov's activities as People's Commissar of Defense and his participation in the repression of military personnel were particularly harshly criticized. Modern researchers believe that the destruction of the Army's command structure in 1937-1938 was one of the main reasons for the catastrophe at the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. As head of the military department, Voroshilov bears direct responsibility for this tragedy. His unsuccessful command of the Leningrad front in 1941 is also seen as an example of a commander's inability to cope with the scale of the tasks before him. At the same time, the positive aspects of Voroshilov's activities cannot be denied. He did contribute to the creation of the mass Red Army, the development of the military industry, and the training of military personnel. Under him, the army received new equipment. Tank and aviation units were created, and a navy was built. The problem lay not so much in the technical equipment of the army, as in the training of commanders and outdated views on the conduct of war. Voroshilov remained a prisoner of the experience of the Civil War and was unable to adapt to the demands of modern military art. Voroshilov remains an interesting figure to study, as an example of a man who rose from the bottom of society to the top of power, as a typical representative of the party nomenclature of the Stalin era. His biography reflects the contradictions of an entire era: revolutionary enthusiasm and the cruelty of repression, sincere belief in a bright future and a willingness to destroy dissenters, the heroism of war and the tragic mistakes of the command. Kliment Voroshilov was a son of his time, with all its virtues and vices. His long life became a mirror reflecting the dramatic history of Russia in the 20th century, from the Tsarist era to developed socialism.